At noon on the 16th of November, 1532, a procession of several thousand unarmed men, women, and children entered the great plaza of Cajamarca, a highland town in what is now Peru. They were the retinue of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, carried on a litter lined with parrot feathers and gold. The emperor had just won a brutal civil war against his half-brother, Huascar, and now held absolute power over the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas. He came to the plaza expecting a peaceful meeting with the strange, bearded foreigners who had been moving through his territory for weeks. He had been told they were envoys from a distant king. He had agreed to meet them unarmed as a sign of trust. Behind the stone walls surrounding the plaza, hidden in the doorways and corridors, waited 168 Spanish soldiers under the command of Francisco Pizarro. They were heavily armored, mounted on horses, and carrying steel swords, crossbows, and a few primitive arquebuses. They had a single cannon placed on a small hill overlooking the square. Most of them were veterans of earlier conquests in the Caribbean and Central America. They were outnumbered by perhaps 100 to 1, but they had a plan that relied on surprise, terror, and the psychological effect of cavalry and gunpowder. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a Spanish priest named Vicente de Valverde stepped forward into the plaza, accompanied by an interpreter. He approached the litter of Atahualpa and began to read aloud from a document known as the Requerimiento. This was a formal demand in Spanish that the emperor convert to Christianity and acknowledge the authority of the Pope and the King of Spain. The words were read in a language Atahualpa did not understand. The interpreter translated poorly. The emperor apparently took the book the priest was holding, a Catholic breviary, examined it briefly, and then tossed it to the ground. The priest later claimed the emperor threw it with contempt. What happened next was almost instantaneous. The Spanish opened fire. The cannon roared, the arquebuses cracked, cavalry burst out of the side streets and charged directly into the dense crowd. The Inca nobles and attendants had no weapons. They had no armor. They could not flee the enclosed plaza because the exits were narrow and blocked by horses. The slaughter was methodical. Spanish infantry cut through the panicked crowd with swords. The horses trampled dozens at a time. The massacre continued for nearly 2 hours. Thousands of Inca were killed. Atahualpa himself was captured, dragged from his overturned litter, and taken to a small stone building in the corner of the plaza. Pizarro had received a slight wound on his hand while pulling the emperor away from his own men. It was the only Spanish injury reported that day. What happened? The capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca was not a battle. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush. The Spanish had been in the region for less than a year. Pizarro arrived on the northern coast of Peru in early 1532 with around 180 men and 37 horses. They had marched inland through harsh mountain terrain, following rumors of a powerful ruler and a city of gold. At Cajamarca, they found the Inca army camped on the hillsides, a force estimated at 40,000 to 80,000 warriors. The Spanish were invited into the town to meet the emperor. Pizarro immediately recognized that diplomacy was a trap waiting to close. His only chance was to strike first, capture the emperor, and hold him hostage. This was a strategy he had used before against indigenous groups in Panama. The Inca had never seen horses, steel, or guns. They had no experience with European military tactics. The Spanish gambled everything on one decisive move. It worked. The emperor was kept in a room measuring about 22 feet by 17 feet. He was allowed to keep his wives and servants. He was fed well, and he was given a proposal. The Spanish would release him if his subjects filled the room with gold once, and then twice with silver. This was an offer Atahualpa later accepted. He sent messengers across the empire to strip temples, palaces, and tombs of their precious metals. Gold arrived first in small ingots and ceremonial objects, then in larger quantities, plates, statues, ornaments, and jewelry, all melted down into bars by Spanish smiths. Over the next 8 months, the room was filled to a height of about 9 feet with gold. The silver followed. The total value, by modern estimates, was roughly 2,500 tons of silver and gold combined. It was the largest ransom ever paid in history, but the Spanish had no intention of honoring their promise. Pizarro feared that if Atahualpa were freed, he would rally his armies and crush the small Spanish force. The ransom was collected, and on the 26th of July, 1533, the emperor was put on trial before a Spanish tribunal. He was charged with polytheism, incest, idolatry, and the murder of his half-brother Huascar. He was convicted, sentenced to death, and executed by garrote, a metal collar tightened around the neck until the vertebrae snapped. The Spanish recorded that Atahualpa asked to be baptized before he died. He was given the Christian name Juan and strangled. Pizarro then ordered a public funeral and mourned the emperor's death for show. How could this have happened? The fall of the Inca emperor was not simply the result of a single afternoon's violence. It was the product of a catastrophic failure of intelligence. The Inca had no written language. Their record-keeping relied on knotted cords called quipus. They had no maps, no alphabetic writing, no way to systematically analyze reports from faraway lands. When the Spanish first appeared on the coast, the news traveled through oral messages, but the rapid pace of the Spanish advance was unlike anything the empire had ever faced. The Inca had known about the Spanish for at least a year before Cajamarca. Atahualpa's own scouts had observed them landing, moving inland and fighting local tribes, but the emperor discounted the threat. He believed the small group of foreigners could be easily overwhelmed or absorbed into his empire. He also believed that his divine status as the son of Inti, the sun god, made him invulnerable. When he walked unarmed into the plaza, he was operating under assumptions that had governed Inca warfare for centuries: that the enemy would negotiate, that hostages would be exchanged, that battles would follow set rituals. The Spanish did not follow those rules. The events at Cajamarca also reveal a deeper failure within the Inca imperial system. The empire was less than 100 years old at the time of the Spanish arrival. It had been built rapidly by a series of warrior kings, starting with Pachacuti, who took power around 143. The Inca expanded by conquest, assimilation, and the imposition of a rigid administrative structure. They built an extensive road network, storehouses, and relay runners who could carry messages across the Andes at speeds that rivaled postal systems in Europe. They mastered terraced agriculture, irrigation, and stone masonry so precise that mortar was not required. But their political stability depended entirely on the authority of a single ruler. When Atahualpa was captured, the entire apparatus of the state collapsed. There was no established mechanism for succession under siege. The nearest legitimate heir, his half-brother Huascar, was in prison. The local governors, generals, and priests had no centralized command. The Inca army, still camped outside Cajamarca, was leaderless and demoralized. The Spanish were able to exploit this vacuum. What investigators have found, archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists, is that the Inca Empire was not an isolated society waiting to be discovered. It was a complex imperial state with a sophisticated economy, a system of labor taxation called the Mita, and a religion that centered on ancestor worship and astronomical observation. The capital, Cusco, was laid out in the shape of a puma. The empire stretched from modern-day Colombia to central Chile, encompassing every conceivable climate from coastal desert to high-altitude tundra. Roads spanned over 25,000 miles. Bridges of woven grass spanned deep gorges. Storehouses along the routes held enough grain and dried meat to feed an army for months. The Inca had no wheel, no iron, no draft animals larger than llamas, yet they built structures that have survived centuries of earthquakes. Their agricultural system produced enough surplus to sustain a population estimated at 10 to 15 million people. The system that failed was not a set of physical structures, but a system of belief and control. The Inca relied on rapid communication through runners, but they trusted that communication too much. Atahualpa knew the Spanish were coming. He gathered his main army, perhaps the largest military force in the Western Hemisphere, and waited. He did not attack the Spanish while they were crossing the narrow passes of the Andes, where a few rocks could have blocked their advance. He did not cut their supply lines. He did not even fortify the plaza. He assumed that negotiation was the only sensible course. The Spanish, by contrast, assumed that treachery was the only reliable tactic. Why does this event still matter? The fall of the Inca Empire is frequently presented as a story of European technological superiority: horses, steel, guns, germs, and writing. But the real story is one of opportunity, mistaken assumptions, and a level of cultural misunderstanding so profound that one side could not even comprehend the other's motivations. The Spanish saw the Inca as pagans to be converted and resources to be exploited. The Inca saw the Spanish as something between gods and barbarians. Neither side understood the other's conception of power, property, or human worth. The capture of Atahualpa set a template for every subsequent European encounter with indigenous American empires. It showed that a small, motivated group of men could topple an entire civilization if they struck at the head. But it also destroyed a functioning state that had maintained stability, fed its people, and built remarkable infrastructure for generations. The gold and silver extracted from the Inca mines funded the Spanish Empire for 2 centuries. The Mita system was turned into a form of forced labor that nearly destroyed the Andean population. By the end of the 16th century, the indigenous population of Peru had fallen by perhaps 90% due to disease, warfare, and exploitation. But the Inca Empire was not simply erased. Its descendants still live in the highlands. The Quechua language spoken by the Inca is still spoken by millions. The stone walls of Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo still stand. The roads are still walked. The story of Cajamarca is not the end of the Inca story. It is the moment when 2 worlds collided with such force that the shock waves are still being measured today. To understand how that collision happened, we must step back to a time before the Spanish arrived, when the Inca were not a conquered people but the masters of the Andes, building an empire from the peaks of the mountains themselves. About 250 years before Atahualpa walked into the plaza at Cajamarca, in the year 1283, a small group of people lived in a narrow valley high in the Peruvian Andes. They called themselves the Inca. Their settlement was a cluster of stone and thatch buildings near a river that ran through what would one day become the central plaza of Cusco. At that time, the Inca were nothing more than a minor ethnic group, one of dozens scattered across the region. Their neighbors were more powerful: the Chancas to the west, the Lupaca to the south, the Kala to the east. The Inca paid tribute, served as warriors for stronger lords, and survived through agriculture on steep mountain slopes. They had no empire. They had no ambition beyond survival. But that changed with a single event. In the year 1438, the Chancas, a powerful rival kingdom, launched an invasion against the Inca. The Chanca army numbered in the tens of thousands. The Inca ruler at the time, Viracocha Inca, fled the capital with his chosen heir. He left the defense of Cusco to a younger son, a prince named Cusi Yupanqui. The prince was not the designated successor. He had been passed over. Yet when the Chanca forces surrounded the city, he refused to retreat. With a small garrison and the help of allied tribes, he mounted a defense. Accounts vary, but the outcome is consistent. The Inca held. The Chanca were repelled. In the aftermath, Cusi Yupanqui took the name Pachacuti, which in Quechua means earth shaker, or he who overturns time. He declared himself the new Sapa Inca, the sole emperor. The empire that he would build began that year. Pachacuti understood something that earlier Inca rulers had not. To survive, the Inca had to stop reacting and start expanding. Within a year of his victory, he reorganized the Inca army into a standing force. He introduced a system of uniform training, standardized weapons, and rotational service. Every male subject from the age of about 25 to 50 could be called to serve. In exchange, the state provided food, clothing, and land for the soldier's family. This was not a mercenary army. It was a national levy tied directly to the imperial economy. By 1445, Pachacuti had subjugated the remaining Chanca strongholds. He did not simply destroy them. He integrated their leaders into the Inca hierarchy. He took their children to Cusco, where they were educated in Inca customs and language, then sent back to govern on his behalf. This was a deliberate strategy. The Inca did not rule by brute force alone. They offered the conquered a path. Accept Inca rule, pay tribute and labor, adopt the Quechua language. Worship the sun god Inti above your own deities, and you could retain your local status. Refuse and your settlement would be starved into submission or destroyed. By 1463, Pachacuti turned his attention south. The Titicaca Basin was controlled by the Kala and Lupaca kingdoms, peoples who had resisted Inca influence for decades. Pachacuti sent his son, Topa Inca Yupanqui, to lead the campaign. Topa Inca proved as capable as his father. He conquered the Kala in a series of battles that took 4 years. The Lupaca fell soon after. By 1471, when Pachacuti died, the Inca Empire extended from the Cusco region down to the shores of Lake Titicaca and west to the Pacific coast. The capital of Cusco had been rebuilt into a city of stone palaces, temples, and plazas. The population of the empire had grown from perhaps 100,000 to over 1 million. Topa Inca Yupanqui succeeded his father and continued expansion. He launched the largest military campaign in Inca history, marching north into what is now Ecuador. The campaign lasted from 1471 to about 1493. The Inca army advanced through the highlands, building roads and storehouses as they went. They encountered the Kingdom of Quito, a well-organized state with its own armies and fortifications. The war lasted years. Topa Inca personally led the final assault on the fortress of Quito. The city fell. The king of Quito was captured and executed. But Topa Inca did not stop. He pushed north into the territory of the Pasto people, near the modern border of Colombia and Ecuador. He also sent expeditions east into the Amazon basin, though the jungle proved difficult to hold. During these campaigns, Topa Inca introduced a new form of imperial control, the Mitmac. Entire populations of conquered peoples were forcibly relocated to different parts of the empire. A village of farmers from the coast might be moved to a highland valley. A community of weavers from the Altiplano might be resettled near Quito. The purpose was to break local loyalties, spread knowledge of Inca techniques, and ensure that no region could unify against the empire. The Mitmac affected hundreds of thousands of people. It was one of the most ambitious social engineering projects in pre-Columbian America. Topa Inca also built the second great infrastructure system, the Royal Road Network. The road had been started under Pachacuti, but Topa Inca expanded it into a network spanning over 25,000 miles. 2 main north-south routes ran the length of the empire. One followed the coast, crossing deserts and river valleys. The other ran through the highlands, climbing passes over 14,000 feet. Bridges of woven grass spanned deep gorges, some over 150 feet long. Way stations, called tambos, were placed every 12 to 15 miles. They stored food, blankets, weapons, and sandals for the runners and the army. At each tambo, a relay runner would carry messages to the next station. A message from Quito to Cusco, about 1,000 miles, could be delivered in 4 to 5 days. That was faster than any system in Europe at the time. But the road was not just for communication. It was the backbone of the Inca state. Along it moved columns of soldiers, lines of llamas carrying goods, and the constant flow of labor. The Inca had no wheeled vehicles, but the road was engineered for walking. Stone paving, drainage channels, retaining walls, and staircases on steep slopes made it a permanent structure. Sections of it survive today, still passable after 5 centuries. When Topa Inca died around 1493, he was succeeded by his son Huayna Capac. Huayna Capac inherited an empire that stretched from southern Colombia to central Chile, over 3,000 miles along the spine of the Andes. The population was estimated at 10 to 15 million people. The imperial bureaucracy was sophisticated. Every household was registered. Every adult owed labor to the state, the mita. In return, the state stored surplus food, provided for the elderly and disabled, and organized festivals and religious ceremonies. The Inca did not use currency. They did not trade for profit. The economy was based on reciprocity and redistribution. The emperor gave to his subjects in the form of land, food, and protection. The subjects gave back in labor and tribute. Huayna Capac spent most of his reign consolidating the northern territories. He built a new palace in Tumabamba in modern Ecuador and spent years there. He also faced the first real external threat, reports of strange men on the coast. Around 1525, Huayna Capac received word of bearded foreigners landing near the Gulf of Guayaquil. They were carrying metal weapons and riding large animals. The Inca did not know what to make of these reports. Some of his advisors suggested they were gods. Others thought they were a new tribe from the jungle. Huayna Capac ordered a garrison placed at the border, but he did not mobilize the army. He was more concerned with internal threats. He had recently crushed a rebellion in the southern province of Calasuyu. He was also ill, possibly with smallpox or a similar European disease that had arrived ahead of the Europeans themselves. In 1527, Huayna Capac died. The cause is uncertain. Some accounts say he was poisoned by a rival. Others say he died of a fever. What is clear is that his death triggered a succession crisis. He had two sons by different mothers. One, Huascar, was born in Cusco and favored by the southern nobility. The other, Atahualpa, was born in Quito and favored by the northern generals. Huascar was declared Sapa Inca in Cusco. Atahualpa refused to accept him. A civil war began. The Inca Civil War lasted from 1527 to 1553. It was brutal. The two brothers led armies that marched through the empire, burning towns, executing prisoners, and conscripting entire populations. Atahualpa's northern generals were experienced from the campaigns under Huayna Capac. Huascar's armies were larger but less disciplined. The war seesawed for years. Atahualpa's forces eventually pushed south, capturing Cusco in 1553. Huascar was captured and imprisoned. Atahualpa established his headquarters at Cajamarca in the northern highlands. He was preparing to consolidate his rule when word arrived that the bearded men were back. They had landed on the coast and were moving inland. The bearded men were Francisco Pizarro and a company of about 168 Spaniards, including 62 horsemen. They had been marching for months. They had no idea that the empire they were entering was in the middle of a civil war. They knew only that the land was rich, the roads were good, and the people were numerous. They arrived at Cajamarca on the 15th of November, 1553. What happened next changed the course of history. Pizarro sent an envoy to the Inca camp, inviting Atahualpa to meet him in the plaza of Cajamarca the next day. Atahualpa accepted. He arrived the following afternoon, carried on a litter by 80 nobles. He was accompanied by perhaps 5,000 unarmed attendants. The plaza was empty. The Spanish were hidden in the buildings around it. When Atahualpa paused, a Spanish priest named Vicente de Valverde approached him, holding a cross and a Bible. He began to explain the Christian faith. Atahualpa had never seen a book. He took it, examined it, and when it did not speak to him, he threw it to the ground. That was the signal. The Spanish fired their arquebuses and cannons. The horsemen charged into the crowd. Unarmed Inca were slaughtered. The nobility who carried the litter were killed instantly. Atahualpa was seized. In the chaos, the Spanish dragged him into a building and locked the door. The attack lasted perhaps an hour. An estimated 2,000 Inca were dead. Not a single Spaniard was killed, but the Spanish were still vastly outnumbered. The Inca army outside Cajamarca numbered perhaps 40,000 warriors. If they had attacked the Spanish garrison, they could have overwhelmed it, but they did not. Emperor was captive. The chain of command was broken. The generals hesitated. Pizarro understood this. He used Atahualpa as a hostage, issuing orders through him to keep the Inca loyal. That is when Atahualpa offered the ransom. The ransom room, as it became known, measures about 22 feet long by 17 feet wide. The Inca agreed to fill it with gold up to a line marked on the wall. Over the next 8 months, gold and silver poured in from across the empire. Temples were stripped. Tombs were looted. The Inca stripped their own civilization to save their emperor, but the Spanish had no intention of honoring their promise. Pizarro feared that if Atahualpa were freed, he would rally his armies and crush the small Spanish force. The ransom was collected, and on the 26th of July, 1533, the emperor was put on trial before a Spanish tribunal. He was charged with polytheism, incest, idolatry, and the murder of his half-brother Huascar. He was convicted, sentenced to death, and executed by garrote, a metal collar tightened around the neck until the vertebrae snapped. The Spanish recorded that Atahualpa asked to be baptized before he died. He was given the Christian name Juan and strangled. Pizarro then ordered a public funeral and mourned the emperor's death for show. How could this have happened? The fall of the Inca emperor was not simply the result of a single afternoon's violence. It was the product of a catastrophic failure of intelligence. The Inca had no written language. Their record-keeping relied on knotted cords called quipas. They had no maps, no alphabetic writing, no way to systematically analyze reports from faraway lands. When the Spanish first appeared on the coast, the news traveled through oral messages, but the rapid pace of the Spanish advance was unlike anything the empire had ever faced. The Inca had known about the Spanish for at least a year before Cajamarca. Atahualpa's own scouts had observed them landing, moving inland and fighting local tribes, but the emperor discounted the threat. He believed the small group of foreigners could be easily overwhelmed or absorbed into his empire. He also believed that his divine status as the son of Inti, the sun god, made him invulnerable. When he walked unarmed into the plaza, he was operating under assumptions that had governed Inca warfare for centuries, that the enemy would negotiate, that hostages would be exchanged, that battles would follow set rituals. The Spanish did not follow those rules. The events at Cajamarca also reveal a deeper failure within the Inca imperial system. The empire was less than 100 years old at the time of the Spanish arrival. It had been built rapidly by a series of warrior kings, starting with Pachacuti, who took power around 143. The Inca expanded by conquest, assimilation, and the imposition of a rigid administrative structure. They built an extensive road network, storehouses, and relay runners who could carry messages across the Andes at speeds that rivaled postal systems in Europe. They mastered terraced agriculture, irrigation, and stone masonry so precise that mortar was not required. But their political stability depended entirely on the authority of a single ruler. When Atahualpa was captured, the entire apparatus of the state collapsed. There was no established mechanism for succession under siege. The nearest legitimate heir, his half-brother Huascar, was in prison. The local governors, generals, and priests had no centralized command. The Inca army, still camped outside Cajamarca, was leaderless and demoralized. The Spanish were able to exploit this vacuum. What investigators have found, archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists, is that the Inca Empire was not an isolated society waiting to be discovered. It was a complex imperial state with a sophisticated economy, a system of labor taxation called the Mita, and a religion that centered on ancestor worship and astronomical observation. The capital, Cusco, was laid out in the shape of a puma. The empire stretched from modern-day Colombia to central Chile, encompassing every conceivable climate from coastal desert to high-altitude tundra. Roads spanned over 25,000 miles. Bridges of woven grass spanned deep gorges. Storehouses along the routes held enough grain and dried meat to feed an army for months. The Inca had no wheel, no iron, no draft animals larger than llamas. Yet they built structures that have survived centuries of earthquakes. Their agricultural system produced enough surplus to sustain a population estimated at 10 to 15 million people. The system that failed was not a set of physical structures, but a system of belief and control. The Inca relied on rapid communication through runners, but they trusted that communication too much. Atahualpa knew the Spanish were coming. He gathered his main army, perhaps the largest military force in the Western Hemisphere, and waited. He did not attack the Spanish while they were crossing the narrow passes of the Andes, where a few rocks could have blocked their advance. He did not cut their supply lines. He did not even fortify the plaza. He assumed that negotiation was the only sensible course. The Spanish, by contrast, assumed that treachery was the only reliable tactic. Why does this event still matter? The fall of the Inca Empire is frequently presented as a story of European technological superiority: horses, steel, guns, germs, and writing. But the real story is one of opportunity, mistaken assumptions, and a level of cultural misunderstanding so profound that one side could not even comprehend the other's motivations. The Spanish saw the Inca as pagans to be converted and resources to be exploited. The Inca saw the Spanish as something between gods and barbarians. Neither side understood the other's conception of power, property, or human worth. The capture of Atahualpa set a template for every subsequent European encounter with indigenous American empires. It showed that a small, motivated group of men could topple an entire civilization if they struck at the head. But it also destroyed a functioning state that had maintained stability, fed its people, and built remarkable infrastructure for generations. The gold and silver extracted from the Inca mines funded the Spanish Empire for 2 centuries. The Mita system was turned into a form of forced labor that nearly destroyed the Andean population. By the end of the 16th century, the indigenous population of Peru had fallen by perhaps 90% due to disease, warfare, and exploitation. But the Inca Empire was not simply erased. Its descendants still live in the highlands. The Quechua language, spoken by the Inca, is still spoken by millions. The stone walls of Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo still stand. The roads are still walked. The story of Cajamarca is not the end of the Inca story. It is the moment when 2 worlds collided with such force that the shock waves are still being measured today. To understand how that collision happened, we must step back to a time before the Spanish arrived, when the Inca were not a conquered people, but the masters of the Andes, building an empire from the peaks of the mountains themselves. Before the roads, before the temples, before the gold, there was a single valley. The Cusco Valley, at an elevation of 11,000 feet, was not an obvious place for a capital. The soil was thin. The climate was harsh, with cold nights and a short growing season. The valley was surrounded by higher peaks and deep ravines. Yet this valley became the center of the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas. How did it happen? Part of the answer lies in geography. The valley was defensible. The passes leading into it could be held by a small force. The rivers provided water for irrigation. The surrounding mountains contained valuable resources: obsidian for tools, salt for preservation, and stone for construction. But the real advantage was the Inca approach to labor. The Mita system, as it developed under Pachacuti, was not a tax in goods but in time. Every able-bodied adult was required to work for the state for a set number of days per year. This labor could be used for building roads, terraces, bridges, storehouses, temples, palaces, and irrigation canals. The state provided food and drink during the work period. In return, the workers were fed from state warehouses when their own crops failed. The system was not voluntary, it was compulsory, but it was also reciprocal. The Inca state stored surplus and distributed it during times of scarcity. This made the empire remarkably resilient to famine. The Mita also allowed the Inca to undertake projects that would have been impossible for a smaller state. The terraces that lined the Andes were built by Mita labor. They transformed steep hillsides into productive farmland. They prevented erosion, allowed the cultivation of maize at high altitudes, and extended the growing season. The Inca built over 1 million acres of terraces across the empire. Each one was carefully designed, with layers of gravel, sand, and topsoil to manage water drainage. Some have been in continuous use for 500 years. The The storehouses, known as calcas, were another marvel. They were circular stone structures built on hillsides, with ventilation channels to keep grain dry. A typical calca could hold about 250 bushels of corn. Thousands of them were built along the road network. When the Spanish arrived, they found storehouses still full of food, years after the collapse of the Inca government. The system had been designed to operate without central control, relying on local administrators who answered to the Sapa Inca. The Inca also managed a system of knotted cords, the quipus, to keep records. A quipu consisted of a main cord from which hung dozens of smaller cords, each with knots tied at different positions. The color, length, and placement of the knots encoded information. Quipus were used to record census data, tax collections, storage inventories, and even narrative histories. The knots were binary in a sense, but they were also positional like an abacus. Quipu kamyaks, or professional quipu makers, were trained from childhood. The system was fast and accurate. It allowed the Inca to manage an empire without writing, but it had a weakness. Quipus could not be read by outsiders, and when the Spanish destroyed the quipus as pagan objects, much of Inca history was lost. The religion of the Inca was also a tool of control. The sun god, Inti, was the patron of the empire. The Sapa Inca was considered his descendant. Major temples, like the Coricancha in Cusco, were covered in gold leaf to reflect the sun's light. The Inca absorbed the gods of conquered peoples into their pantheon, but they required those peoples to worship Inti first. This created a hierarchy that mirrored the political order. The chief priest of the sun, the Wilak Umu, was second only to the Sapa Inca. Religious festivals such as Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, were held annually and reinforced loyalty. The Inca built shrines called huacas throughout the empire, sacred rocks, springs, and mountains where offerings were made. The landscape itself was sacred. The empire was organized around lines of these huacas, radiating from Cusco. It was a spiritual geography as much as a political one. The Inca religion also contained a fatal flaw. It was deeply tied to the person of the emperor. When the emperor died, his mummy was preserved and continued to be consulted in matters of state. He was still considered a living being. His estates, lands, and wealth were held in his name forever. This meant that each new emperor had to acquire his own fortune. The Inca practice of primogeniture was not absolute. New emperors needed to conquer new land to support themselves and their followers. The empire expanded not only because of ambition, but because of institutional necessity. The system required perpetual growth. When growth stopped, the system began to crack. Huayna Capac's reign had seen the empire reach its maximum extent. After his death, there was nowhere left to expand. The civil war between his sons was not just a personal conflict. It was a crisis of succession that could not be resolved by conquest. The winner would have to rule an empire that had stopped growing. That winner was Atahualpa, but he inherited a system already strained. The Mita had been pushed to its limits. The storehouses were full, but the loyalty of the provinces was weakening. The Spanish arrived at the worst possible moment. They did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived as scavengers, shipwreck survivors, and desperate men. They came with no maps, no reinforcements, and no clear plan. But they had steel, horses, and a willingness to take risks that the Inca could not imagine. They also had disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza had already swept through the Andes before Pizarro landed. The death toll is impossible to calculate, but it was catastrophic. The Inca believed the gods were punishing them. The Spanish believed God was on their side. Both were wrong. What remains of the Inca Empire today are the stones. The walls of Sacsayhuaman, the terraces of Moray, the fortress of Ollantaytambo, the city of Machu Picchu. These structures are still standing because they were built better than they needed to be. The Inca did not design for permanence. They designed for earthquakes. They cut stones so precisely that a piece of paper cannot be slipped between them. They used no mortar, only gravity and friction. After an earthquake, the stones settle back into place. In Cusco, Spanish colonial buildings were erected on Inca foundations. When earthquakes hit, the Spanish buildings fell. The Inca walls did not. The empire fell, but the people did not. They adapted. They learned Spanish but kept Quechua. They converted to Christianity but maintained their own rituals. They lost their gold but kept their land. The Mita system was turned into forced labor for Spanish mines, but some communities managed to preserve their lands. The rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in 1780 was a direct descendant of the Inca resistance. It was crushed, but it was not forgotten. In the 21st century, the descendants of the Inca still farm the same terraces. They still walk the same roads. They still celebrate Inti Raymi every winter solstice in Cusco. The empire is gone. The civilization is not. On the 18th of May 1781, in the main plaza of Cusco, a man was brought forward to be executed. He was tied to a post. The executioner was ordered to cut out his tongue first. Then his hands and feet were tied to horses. The horses were urged in opposite directions. The body did not tear apart. The executioner then beheaded him with a machete. The man was Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui, known as Tupac Amaru II. He claimed descent from the last Inca emperor. He had led the largest rebellion against Spanish rule in the colonial period. His death was meant to be a warning. It became a symbol instead. What happened? The rebellion began in November of 1780. Tupac Amaru II captured and executed a Spanish governor named Antonio de Arriaga in the town of Tinta, south of Cusco. The governor had been abusive, known for forcing indigenous people to work in the mines without pay. The rebellion spread quickly. Within weeks, tens of thousands of indigenous and mixed-race people had joined. Tupac Amaru II marched toward Cusco. The Spanish were caught off guard. But they regrouped. The rebels laid siege to Cusco for several weeks but could not take it. The Spanish brought in reinforcements from Lima. The rebellion was crushed. Tupac Amaru II was captured in April 1780. His trial was brief. His execution was public. The Spanish believed they had ended the threat. What they had not understood was that the rebellion had changed something fundamental. The idea of an independent Inca state had been destroyed in the 16th century, but the memory of it had not been extinguished. Tupac Amaru II had lit a fuse that would burn for 200 years. How could this have happened? The Spanish colonial system had created a hierarchy based on race. At the top were the Peninsulars, Spaniards born in Spain. Below them were the Criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas. Below them were the Mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous descent. At the bottom were the indigenous people, the descendants of the Inca. They were required to pay tribute, work in the mines, and provide labor for public works. They were denied education. Their language was suppressed. Their religion was banned. Their leaders were executed or forced into submission. For 250 years they had endured this system, but the system had weakened. The Spanish crown was distracted by wars in Europe. The colonial administration was corrupt and inefficient. The Catholic Church had lost some of its authority. The indigenous population had begun to grow again after the catastrophic decline caused by disease. They had learned Spanish. They had learned to read. They had learned to organize. Tupac Amaru II was a product of this change. He was a wealthy landowner educated in a Jesuit school. He spoke Quechua and Spanish. He knew the law. He used the law to argue for the rights of his people. When that failed, he turned to arms. The rebellion failed, but it was not entirely futile. The Spanish abolished the Mita system in some regions after the rebellion. They reduced tribute demands. They allowed indigenous communities to hold land in common. But these reforms were limited and often ignored. The deeper problem remained. The colonial system was built on inequality. It could not be reformed. It had to be destroyed. That destruction would come in the early 19th century, when the wars of independence swept across South America. In Peru, the independence movement was led by José de San Martin and Simón Bolívar. They were criollos, not indigenous. They fought for a republic, not an Inca restoration. But the symbols of the Inca were used in their flags and anthems. The memory of Tupac Amaru II was revived. In the 20th century, he became a hero of the left. In the 21st century, his image appears on currency and in murals. The execution in Cusco did not end the story. It began a new chapter. What remains of the Inca Empire today is not only the stones, it is also the language. Quechua, the language of the Inca, is still spoken by about 8 million people across the Andes. It was the official language of the empire, and it survived the Spanish conquest. The Spanish tried to suppress it, but they also used it as a tool of conversion. Missionaries learned Quechua and translated catechisms into it. This preserved the language in written form. Today, Quechua is an official language of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. It is taught in some schools. It is used in radio broadcasts. It is spoken in the markets of Cusco, in the fields of the highlands, and in the immigrant neighborhoods of Lima. The empire is gone. The language is not. The roads of the Inca are still used. The Quhapac-Ñan, the great road system that connected the empire, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It stretches for over 18,000 miles. Some sections are paved with stone. Some are simple trails. In remote parts of the Andes, they are still the most practical way to travel. Mules and llamas walk them. Villagers carry goods along them. The suspension bridges are gone, but the stone bridges remain. The tambos, or way stations, are ruins, but their locations are still marked on maps. The road system was the backbone of the empire. It enabled rapid communication, troop movement, and trade. It also facilitated control. The Spanish used the same roads to conquer the empire. Then they let them fall into disrepair. But in many places, they are still there, waiting to be noticed. The agricultural terraces of the Inca continue to produce food. In the Sacred Valley near Cusco, farmers still plant maize, potatoes, and quinoa on terraces built 500 years ago. The terraces are not only functional, they are also a form of history. Each terrace reflects the labor of the Mita system. Each one represents a decision about water management, soil conservation, and crop rotation. The Inca did not invent terrace farming, but they perfected it. Their terraces were so well designed that they still work today. When the global demand for quinoa increased in the early 21st century, the terraces of the Andes became valuable once again. Farmers who had abandoned them returned. They repaired the stones. They planted the seeds. The Inca had prepared the land for a harvest that would come centuries later. The quipus, the knotted cords used for record keeping, are still being studied. For a long time, scholars believed that quipus were only used for numerical records. Recent research has suggested that they may also encode narrative information. The knots may represent syllables, words, or concepts. The colors may indicate categories. The twisting of the cords may indicate grammatical relationships. A new generation of researchers is using digital imaging and three-dimensional scanning to analyze quipus. They are comparing them to early Spanish texts that describe Inca history. They are trying to unlock a system of writing that has been lost for 400 years. If they succeed, the history of the Inca may need to be rewritten. The Spanish destroyed many quipus, but they did not destroy all of them. A few hundred survive in museums and private collections. They are the last voices of an empire that never learned to write. The Inca calendar is still observed. Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, is celebrated every year on the winter solstice in Cusco. It was banned by the Spanish after the conquest. The last official Inti Raymi was held in 1535. In 1944, the festival was revived as a cultural performance. Today, it draws thousands of tourists and participants. It is staged at the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, above Cusco. Actors dressed as the Sapa Inca and his entourage perform rituals that were once sacred. They offer chicha, the maize beer, to the sun. They recite prayers in Quechua. They burn llama fat as incense. The festival is not a direct continuation of the original. It is a reconstruction, invented in the 20th century. But it reflects a desire to reclaim a lost identity. It is a reminder that the empire did not vanish without a trace. It left behind a residue of symbols, stories, and practices that could be revived. The human cost of the conquest is still visible in the genetic record. The population of the Andes today is largely mixed. Indigenous ancestry is common, but the European and African ancestry introduced by the conquest has reshaped the gene pool. Medical studies have found that the indigenous population of the Andes has a higher risk of certain diseases, including gallstones and type 2 diabetes. These may be linked to dietary changes forced by the Spanish. The Incas ate a diet based on maize, potatoes, quinoa, and llama meat. The Spanish introduced wheat, beef, pork, and sugar. The traditional diet was healthier. The shift to a European diet had health consequences that persist today. The conquest was not only a political and military event, it was a biological one. The Spanish also introduced horses, cattle, sheep, and donkeys to the Andes. These animals transformed the landscape. The Inca had only llamas and alpacas. The Spanish animals required different types of pasture and water management. Overgrazing led to erosion. The soil that the Inca had carefully terraced and irrigated began to wash away. The climate in the Andes is harsh. The Spanish did not understand it. They tried to plant crops that could not survive at high altitude. They failed. The Inca had succeeded because they understood the land. They had lived with it for centuries. The Spanish were outsiders. They conquered the empire, but they could not conquer the geography. The Inca also left behind a legal legacy. The idea of reciprocal labor, the mita, was transformed into a system of forced labor under the Spanish. But the principle that the state owed something to its subjects did not disappear. It was absorbed into the colonial administration. It then passed into the republican governments that followed independence. In the 20th century, the government of Peru established a system of social programs that borrowed from the Inca model. The state provided food and infrastructure in exchange for labor. It was not the mita, but it was a descendant of it. The Inca had established a precedent for state responsibility. The Spanish had exploited it. The modern state had inherited it. The Inca also left behind a political problem. The conquest created a rupture in the political order. The Sapa Inca was killed. The royal family was scattered. The nobles were reduced to commoners. The empire was replaced by a colonial administration that had no legitimacy in the eyes of the indigenous population. That lack of legitimacy has never been fully resolved. The modern states of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador are still struggling with the legacy of the conquest. Indigenous movements demand recognition, land rights, and political autonomy. The Constitution of Bolivia, rewritten in 2009, explicitly acknowledges the indigenous origins of the state. The president, Evo Morales, was the first indigenous leader of Bolivia in over 400 years. The empire may be gone, but its shadow still falls across the Andes. The Inca Empire fell because of a convergence of factors: civil war, disease, technological disparity, and strategic errors. But it also fell because of a cultural gap. The Inca could not understand the Spanish, and the Spanish could not understand the Inca. The Spanish saw gold. The Inca saw the sun. The Spanish saw a political structure that could be exploited. The Inca saw a sacred order that had been disrupted. The two worldviews could not be reconciled. The Spanish won, but the victory was not complete. The Inca are still there. Their language, their terraces, their roads, their festivals, their memory. The empire was destroyed, but the civilization survived. It adapted. It changed. It persists. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire is one of the most dramatic episodes in world history. It was characterized by audacity, violence, greed, and courage. It was also characterized by misunderstanding. The Spanish never fully grasped what they had destroyed. They wrote about it in their chronicles, but they wrote from their own perspective. They described the Inca as barbarians, idolaters, and tyrants. They did not recognize the sophistication of the Inca state. They did not understand the mita system, the quipus, the roads, or the terraces. They saw what they wanted to see. The result is a historical record that is incomplete and biased. The Inca view of the conquest has been lost. There are no Inca chronicles. There are only Spanish ones. The conquest is a story told by the winners, but the losers left their mark on the stones. Those stones are still speaking. At 3 in the afternoon on the 16th of November 1532, in the plaza of Cajamarca, a Spanish priest handed a Bible to the Inca Emperor Atahualpa. The priest was Vicente de Valverde. He spoke through an interpreter. He explained that the Christian God required obedience. He said that the Spanish king, Charles V, was the rightful sovereign of the world. Atahualpa took the book. He held it to his ear. He heard nothing. He threw it to the ground. That was the signal. The Spanish opened fire. The plaza was packed with thousands of Inca nobles and attendants. They were unarmed. Atahualpa had come for a peaceful meeting. He had been suspicious of the strangers but confident in his army. He had brought only a ceremonial escort. The Spanish had concealed arquebuses, crossbows, and cavalry in the buildings around the plaza. When the first volley rang out, the Inca panicked. They tried to flee, but the exits were blocked. The Spanish horsemen charged into the crowd. The slaughter lasted about 2 hours. By the end, thousands of Incas lay dead. Atahualpa was captured. Not a single Spaniard was killed. What happened? The Battle of Cajamarca was not a battle. It was an ambush. It was a calculated act of violence designed to decapitate the Inca state. Francisco Pizarro, the Spanish leader, had studied the tactics of Cortés in Mexico. He knew that capturing the ruler could paralyze an empire. He had been in the Andes for less than a year. He had only 168 men. He had horses, steel, and gunpowder. But he was outnumbered by the Inca army by thousands. Pizarro understood that direct confrontation would be suicidal. He understood that surprise and deception were his only weapons. He set the trap in Cajamarca. It worked perfectly. The capture of Atahualpa at 3 p.m. on that November afternoon changed the course of history. The emperor was held for ransom. He promised to fill a room with gold and 2 rooms with silver in exchange for his freedom. The Spanish agreed. Over the next 8 months, Incas from across the empire carried treasure to Cajamarca. They stripped temples, palaces, and tombs. They brought gold sheets, silver statues, and precious artifacts. By July 1533, the room was filled. The ransom was the largest in human history, but the Spanish did not release Atahualpa. They were afraid that he would rally his armies if freed. They were also divided among themselves. On the 26th of July 1533, they executed Atahualpa by garrote. He was strangled in the plaza of Cajamarca. His body was burned. His ashes were scattered. The Inca state did not collapse immediately. Atahualpa's death created a power vacuum. His half-brother Huascar had already been killed during the Civil War. The legitimate line of succession was broken. The Spanish exploited this. They installed a puppet emperor, Manco Inca, in Cusco. They claimed to be restoring order. Manco cooperated at first. He believed that the Spanish would leave after taking the gold. He was wrong. The Spanish demanded more treasure. They looted the Temple of the Sun in Cusco. They melted down the gold sheets that covered the walls. They took the silver and the jewelry. They treated the Inca nobles as servants. Manco realized that he had been betrayed. On the 18th of April 1536, Manco Inca escaped from Cusco. He gathered an army. He returned on the 6th of May. He laid siege to the city. The siege of Cusco lasted for over a year. Manco commanded an army estimated at 100,000 men. The Spanish defenders numbered about 190. The Inca attacked with slings, arrows, and burning projectiles. They set fire to the thatched roofs of the city. They surrounded the Spanish in the main square. But the Spanish had steel armor, horses, and a fortified stone compound. They also had allies, the Cañari, an indigenous group that hated the Inca. The siege turned into a stalemate. Manco's forces lacked a crucial advantage. They did not know how to break through stone walls. They had no siege engines. They could not prevent the Spanish from receiving reinforcements. In the summer of 1537, Spanish relief forces arrived from the coast. Manco was forced to lift the siege. He retreated to the jungle fortress of Vilcabamba. There he established a rump state. The Neo-Inca state lasted for another 36 years. Manco was assassinated by Spanish deserters in 1544. His son, Tupac Amaru, succeeded him. The Spanish finally captured Vilcabamba in 1570. Tupac Amaru was executed in the main square of Cusco. The last Inca emperor was beheaded. How could this have happened? The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire is often presented as a story of technological superiority. That is true but incomplete. The Spanish had guns, horses, and steel. The Inca had bronze, slings, and woven armor, but numbers matter. The Spanish never had more than a few hundred men in the Andes at any given time. The Inca could have overwhelmed them with sheer mass. They did not. The reason is not only technological. It is epidemiological, political, and psychological. Disease arrived before the Spanish. Smallpox reached the Andes around 1585. It spread along the Inca road system. It killed the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac and his designated heir, Ninan Cayachi. That death triggered the civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa. The empire was divided and exhausted by the time Pizarro arrived. The Spanish also exploited Inca political structures. They used the Mita system to recruit labor. They used the road system to move troops. They used the tribute system to extract food. The Inca state was built for central control. The Spanish simply hijacked that control. The psychological factor is harder to measure. The Inca believed that the gods could appear in human form. The Spanish arrived on unknown animals. They wore gleaming metal. They used thunder and lightning when they fought. Atahualpa may have hesitated because he did not know what the Spanish were. He may have seen them as divine. He may have thought that killing them would invite punishment from the heavens. The chroniclers recorded that Inca soldiers were terrified of the horses. They had never seen such animals. The Spanish exploited that fear. The conquest was also a story of internal division. The Inca had conquered many tribes in the Andes. Those tribes resented Inca rule. The Spanish recruited them as allies. The Cañari, the Huanca, the Chachapoya all fought alongside the Spanish. Without them, the Spanish would have been overwhelmed. The Inca system of forced resettlement had created enemies. When the Spanish offered an alternative, those enemies joined. The aftermath of the conquest was brutal. The Spanish imposed the encomienda system. They gave Spanish settlers control over indigenous labor. The Mita was turned into a forced draft for the silver mines of Potosi. Millions of Incas died from overwork, disease, and violence. The population of the Andes collapsed. In 1520, there were an estimated 12 million people in the Inca Empire. By 1620, there were fewer than 1 million. The recovery took centuries. The empire left behind a deep cultural scar. The Quechua language survived, but the religion, the calendar, the political system were suppressed. The Spanish built churches on top of Inca temples. They replaced the cult of the sun with the cult of the cross. They burned quippus. They forbade the worship of mummies. They tried to erase the memory of the Inca state. They did not succeed entirely. The memory lived on in oral traditions, in festivals, in bloodlines. Today, the site of Cajamarca is a city of 200,000 people. The plaza where Atahualpa was captured is still there. A statue of Atahualpa stands in the center. The room where he was held is now a chapel. The gold he paid for his freedom was melted into bars and shipped to Spain. Most of it was lost in shipwrecks or spent on wars. None of it survives. The silver from Potosi funded the Spanish Empire for centuries. The Inca had mined that silver for centuries before the Spanish arrived. They used it for ornaments, not currency. The Spanish turned it into coins. That distinction marked the difference between two worlds. The Inca Empire fell in a matter of years, but its fall was not a single event. It was a cascade of failures, decisions, and accidents. The capture of Atahualpa at 3 p.m. on the 16th of November 1532 was the trigger. The siege of Cusco in 1536 was the turning point. The execution of Tupac Amaru in 1572 was the end, but the end was not absolute. The terraces still hold. The roads still run. The stones of Sacsayhuaman still fit together without mortar. The empire may be gone, but it has not been forgotten. The masters of the Andes left their mark on the land. That mark cannot be erased. On the 21st of June 2014, the UNESCO World Heritage Committee inscribed the Quhapac Ñan, the Inca road system, as a World Heritage Site. The decision came after years of study by 6 South American countries. The road network stretches over 30,000 kilometers. It crosses deserts, highlands, cloud forests, and river valleys. It connects the former imperial capital of Cusco to the far reaches of the empire, from Quito in the north to Santiago in the south. The designation recognized not only the engineering achievement but the cultural and spiritual meaning of the roads. The Inca built these roads without the wheel, without iron tools, without draft animals. They used stone pavers, retaining walls, suspension bridges, and staircases cut into cliffs. They built way stations every few kilometers. They built storage depots for food and weapons. They built signal towers that could relay a message across the empire in a matter of days. The road system functioned as the nervous system of the Inca state, and it still exists. Much of it is still walkable. Farmers use it, pilgrims use it. Hikers from around the world walk the final segment to Machu Picchu. The road system is not a ruin, it is a living network. What does that mean? The Inca Empire never truly vanished. The people who built it remained. They adapted. They survived. The Quechua language is still spoken by 8 million people across the Andes. It is the most widely spoken indigenous language in the Americas. It survived despite centuries of suppression, despite laws that forbade its use in schools, despite the stigma attached to indigenous identity. In recent decades, Quechua has seen a revival. It is taught in universities. It is used in radio broadcasts. It appears in street signs in Cusco. The grammar, the vocabulary, the worldview embedded in the language carry the memory of the Inca state. The agricultural terraces that line the valleys around Cusco, Moray, Pisac, and Ollantaytambo are still worked by descendants of the Inca. They irrigate with the same canals. They plant the same varieties of potatoes, quinoa, maize. The terraces were built to prevent erosion, retain moisture, and create microclimates. Modern agronomists have studied them. They have found that Inca terrace systems are more resilient to drought and frost than modern monoculture plots. Some farmers have begun restoring abandoned terraces, using the techniques their ancestors perfected 500 years ago. The festival of Inti Raymi, the Feast of the Sun, is held every year on the 24th of June in the fortress of Sacsayhuaman above Cusco. It was the most important religious ceremony of the Inca Empire. The Spanish banned it in the 16th century. In 1944, a local writer and historian reconstructed the ceremony based on colonial chronicles. Today, it is reenacted by hundreds of actors in front of thousands of spectators. The pageantry is carefully choreographed. The Sapa Inca addresses the sun. The priests sacrifice a llama. The chants echo across the ruins. It is not a perfect reconstruction. It is a performance, but it keeps the memory alive. It reminds the world that the Inca Empire was not only a political system. It was a civilization with a deep spiritual connection to the land, the sky, and the cycles of nature. The last emperor, Tupac Amaru, was executed in 1520. But his name was revived 2 centuries later by a rebel leader, José Gabriel Condorcanqui, who called himself Tupac Amaru II. In 1780, he led a massive uprising against Spanish colonial rule. He was captured and executed in the same main square of Cusco where his namesake had died. The rebellion failed, but the name became a symbol of resistance. In the 20th century, indigenous movements in Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Argentina invoked Tupac Amaru as a martyr and a hero. The Shining Path guerrilla group, the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, the Tupac Katari indigenous movement, all drew on the legacy of the Inca rebellion. The empire that fell in 1572 never stopped influencing the world. Its roads, its terraces, its language, its architecture, its political symbolism all endure. The stones of Sacsayhuaman still fit together without mortar. The water still flows through the canals of Tapan. The sun still rises over the Temple of the Sun in Cusco on the winter solstice. The Inca built for eternity. They built with stone, with labor, with faith. They understood that the land would outlast them. They were right. The empire is gone. The land remembers.